Welcome, everyone, to a conversation with Vance, 7-point Australian Highlander extraordinaire. Please, Vance, introduce yourself.
Hey everyone, I'm Vance. So I'm an Australian Highlander player. I used to be on the Australian Highlander points committee up until 2021, I think. Um, I've been playing the format since basically its inception in about 1996, and I've been playing Magic for I don't know, like 12. There's not that much you can have been playing Magic before that, right? Like a year, 2 years at most. Um, I play a variety of decks, mostly aggressive red green decks like Zoo, red green Stompy kind of decks. Um, and yeah, I'm a fan of Australian Highlander, 7-point Highlander, obviously. Love listening to things from the other side of the world in Canadian Highlander, our kind of cousins
I would
over
say,
there.
I would say, Commonwealth, both of us.
Yeah, well, that's right. Yep. Um, yeah. Uh,
That's awesome.
yeah.
So my first question for you, because this is
Yep.
something that everybody that I know that knows about Australian Highlander calls it Australian Highlander, but it seems that there has been a large push, at least on certainly on the website, right? It's 7point.com.au. Is it
Yep.
7-point Highlander? Is it Australian Highlander? Is it both? What's the goal here?
It's kind of both. We try and usually go for 7-point Highlander. This was a choice we made in like 2016 or 2017 kind of time frame. Um, just to give it a bit more potential kind of international appeal, like to not be quite so locally
Mm-hmm.
focused. Um, but yeah, either one is fine.
Yeah, that makes sense. So one of the things that you sort of showed me in the pre-discussion that we had here were some points lists from back in 99 and early 2000s,
Yep.
which were
Yep.
super cool to see. And one of the things I noticed on those points lists is it looked a lot like what the old school points lists or like the Alpha 40 points lists. Um, it's very interesting. Is
Okay.
that sort of like, does that ring a bell? Does that seem like sort of the place that this whole thing started with those original types of points lists, and it just sort of kept carrying this whole time?
So the history of the format. So I played in. Well, I'm not sure if it was the first, but one of the first events.
Hmm.
So format started sometime between Alliances and Mirage. Was the first event with a
Hmm.
points list. There had been one previous one, which was just Highlander, 60 cards, no sideboard, no points list. But unsurprisingly, the best decks in that were just fully powered vintage decks, right?
Right.
You can play all the Moxes. Of course you would if you had them. And so after that, there was a group of people at the ANU bar, um, getting together, chatting about how they enjoyed it, but, it wasn't great. And then one of them had the brilliant idea that, what if you could play any card you wanted, just not all of them at once?
Right. Not all of them together, but just a bunch of them, or your favorite ones.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's right. So if you wanted to play, like an Ancestral Recall, you could do that, but you couldn't play an Ancestral Recall and a Lotus and a Time Walk and, et cetera, et cetera.
You can't be greedy.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And that's kind of where it started. And so those initial lists that I showed you are from a couple of years after that. And at that stage, it was just whoever was running the event got the points list from the last one, looked at what won them, and made a couple of changes,
Right.
just off their own bat, right? Um, and and so if you look at some of those lists, there are some cards on there that you would look at with a modern eye, and really even an eye at the time, and be like, is Stormbind really worth a point? Probably not, right?
Right. Right.
And so a couple of years after those lists, some of the Canberra locals got together, had a chat with Glenn Doyle, who was one of the founding committee members when we eventually get a committee, who was the person who mostly ran events, and said, look, can we put you together like a list which gets rid of a lot of this chaff, cleans up the format, it's at that point that we went to using the vintage band list and sideboards. Because in the early days, again, like Chaos Orb was a card you could just choose to play. It was most of your points on most of those lists. It was like 6 out of 10 or whatever.
I did notice there were 10-point lists. It's interesting. I'm gonna ask you about that at some point, why it went down to 7, but I don't want to interrupt. Please continue the story.
No, yeah, so at a similar time, a couple of people had exported these events down to Melbourne in Australia. And so there were events running down there, and they had their own points list. And there was a lot of, like, Canberra and Melbourne were basically the only two places it was played. And there was a lot of, mostly friendly rivalry between those two cities about whose list was better. And this was until about 2005, maybe, when the two store owners who mostly ran events, so Glenn and Isaac Egan, who'll come up again later, and a couple of the sort of high-profile locals decided to get together and like merge the lists together. And part of the reason for this was, so when Nationals was a thing, there was always a side event at Nationals which was run by the tournament organisers there, where they ran an Australian Highlander event, and they would just get the Melbourne and Canberra lists and just mash them together.
Sure.
Like kind of average them in a way that made no one very happy.
Right. The worst of both worlds. It really doesn't.
Yes. Yeah. And so, this group of people were like, well, why don't we just come up with a, consolidated list, have a group of people who are responsible for making changes. And that's kind of where we got to the position we are now.
So that sort of kicked off in, you said, mid-2000s, 2005, 2006 is when the committee sort of first formed?
Yeah. It was about when Lorwyn came out, or just after that.
Yeah, that would have been 07.
Yeah, okay, so cool. About then. And that's when we moved to 7 points. So Canberra, I think at the time, Canberra was 10 and Melbourne was 5 points. And, there was some argy-bargy between the newly forming committee about what it should be. Mm-hmm. It ended up going for 7. Not for any, like, mathematically precise reason or anything.
Sure.
The reason it ended up being 7 was, they were discussing whether it should be 6 or 7 or 8. And Isaac wanted a points total that was closer to the one that Melbourne had. So they went with 7. Just, those little wins, that little bit of magic player value where you can get it.
You gotta take that 2%, It's important.
Yeah, that's right.
In this game that we play.
Yeah. And yeah, look, since then it's been 7 points consistently. There's been a committee of initially 4 people. I think it's 5 people now. And yeah, it's gone from there. So yeah, I joined the committee in like 2011 or so. Mm-hmm. Was on it for about a decade. And yeah, that's kind of the 2-minute history of the format. And my understanding is, from having chats with Spencer and some of the Yellow Jacket guys, mm-hmm. The first Canadian Highlander points list was one of our points lists from Nationals. Like, I think they got it off Wizards' coverage of Australian Nationals. They were, looking for standard decks or whatever, and they found this, and they're like, oh, that's kind of like a format we play already, and yeah, picked up one of our points lists. So the very first Canadian Highlander points list is exactly whatever the Australian Highlander points list was at the time, and then it's obviously diverged a fair bit since then.
That's wild. I did not know that Australian Highlander predated Canadian Highlander. Is there a reason to think that Australian Highlander is the first sort of format of this nature, or is it one of those invention of calculus where there's like 2 people who independently emerged with it and realized that each other were just doing the same thing?
So I think you can actually trace all of this back, not just our formats, but also European Highlander mm-hmm. and Commander / EDH, back to a single article from I can't remember. I think it's Duelist magazine from like July '96.
Right.
Where there's just this article about a Highlander format. It doesn't have a points list or anything. It's got a bunch of other stuff going on, but it's got like a proto commander idea, but it's singleton decks, and all of these formats start around. A lot of these formats start not long after that. So yeah, it feels like maybe that article is kind of the
catalyst,
genesis.
as it were. Yeah,
Yeah.
It's the term for a virus. The patient zero. The patient zero.
Yeah,
of
patient
all this,
zero. Yeah.
Of all of our fun formats that we have now.
Yeah.
Well, that's super awesome. So one of the things we're going to get into, of course, lots about 7-Point Highlander over the rest of this. But I'm curious, how did you get involved with the council? You said you were on there for a decade. What was that experience like, being a part of the 7-Point Highlander Council?
Look, it's really good. So I got involved because I was I'd been playing it for ages. I was a reasonably well-known, prominent player. I was good friends with the people who were on the committee.
It's a good strategy.
Yeah, it helps a lot. So at the time, the committee was always like the main TO from Canberra and Melbourne, and a player from Canberra and Melbourne. Mm-hmm. And so the Canberra player rep, Anatoly, was standing down, and they basically just asked me if I wanted to take his spot. We don't have it be sort of city regional based anymore, because we eventually realized that was a bit silly. But yeah, that was how I got involved.
That's awesome.
And the experience of being on it was really it's really interesting. As with any kind of community management, public facing kind of role, there are times when it's not so fun.
Yeah.
That people can be very frustrating to deal with sometimes. People can have extremely strong opinions about their very niche hobbies. Like, people who are extremely adamant that artifact decks need to have less points on them or more points on them or whatever.
Right.
But by and large, it's pretty great. People understand that, these committee roles aren't paid or anything. It's people doing it out of passion, volunteering, doing the best they can. Mistakes are going to be made. I've certainly, been responsible for a couple of mistakes on the points list over time. But people are mostly trying to do their best, and, we listen to the community as much as we can. There are times when people want things that are just for a variety of reasons, not practical. Like, you've got to...
They're wrong, is what they are.
Look, sometimes people are just completely wrong.
Right.
Sometimes people aren't strictly wrong, but there's
it's more nuanced than they make it out to be.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Often more nuanced, but also with any point system you've got. So whether you've got, because I know Canadian Highlander has been at various times 7 points and 14 points, and it's been 10 points for a while now. You can't have every card at a precise level of points unless you're at a 7,000 point system, right?
Yeah.
There's always going to be some cards which are slightly over or underpointed, and which cards those are can vary depending on what kind of decks you like to play or your opinion on, there are some people who would like to see the Undercity just as a general concept be, banned outright from the format or have a bunch of extra points added to it. There are some people who are like, it's actually great. We should, reduce the amount of points on it. These things are always somewhat a matter of opinion. Mm-hmm. There's no science,
It is an art and a science.
Yeah.
Very much.
Yeah.
It is very much neither of those two things in isolation.
Yeah, exactly.
So one of the things that I definitely have sort of picked up as I've looked into a bit of 7-Point Highlander, and especially seeing the size of some of the events that are being ran down under, there's a very impassioned player base. There's a lot of folks who have found, it's been a phenomenally successful. What do you think draws people to 7-Point Highlander?
So I think there's a couple of things. One, I do think that point system Highlander formats are they're a really interesting deck building challenge.
Yeah.
They give you a lot of room for both analysis of, as you were saying, the science and the art. So, analyzing what's going on and what would be good, but also playing cards that you really like, and you can still do reasonably well with them. As you would know from Canadian Highlander, like that bit of extra variance adds some delightful spice to the games.
Absolutely.
Where even though you're obviously trying to make your deck be pretty consistent and doing the thing it does, because you can't play 4 of card X, you've got to play cards that have, slightly different properties, and sometimes you'll draw them and it'll be worse than the other option in that slot, and sometimes you'll be like, oh, this has a little extra thing that helps me in this situation. So that's really good. The other thing that has driven Highlander of events in Australia is it's always been something that's been played by, like, it's the format all the competitive players go to have fun, right?
Yeah.
The best players in the country, by and large, all play. Not everyone, but like most of the best players over time, and most of the long-term players play the format because it's a cool, fun format that they can directly influence. Is part of it. But also, we've always had fairly big prize events, like because of, again, people like Glenn and Isaac being major TOs. Glenn now runs all of the whatever they're called, the RCs,
RCQs.
RCQs, he runs all of those.
Yeah, the regional championships.
And so he always organises to have a 7-point Highlander side event at those. For
Awesome.
People crashed out of the main event on the second day. There'll be one of those usually, or sometimes it'll be on the day before. But right. There's always one, and there's often pretty good prizes for them. So a 50-player side event for where first place is a volcanic island or something is pretty common, right? And that draws players in. There have been 2 events this year. Highlander Nationals in January, which had just under 200 players, and the top 2 prizes were a time walk and a mox.
And unlimited, not CE, unlimited power.
Yeah, unlimited power. Yeah. And then in Melbourne, more recently, we had another event where the top 2 prizes were, it was power. I can't remember. I think it was a time walk again, and I can't remember the other one. It was probably also a mox.
Yeah.
On average, it's going to be a mox. It wasn't a Lotus and it wasn't a Time Twister, that's for sure.
Yeah, those are the 2 most expensive pieces of power.
Yeah. So I think it's a combination of, obviously the format's a lot of fun, but also there have been sort of consistent over time these big events. Even when we had Grand Prix being run by Channel Fireball, we petitioned them to run some Highlander events. The prizes weren't as good, but we still had a lot of players playing in those.
You still had the community and people.
Yeah.
When the events were being ran, people decided that they wanted to come play in the events because the format was just fun to play.
Yeah, exactly.
So what do you think 7-point Highlander really does right as a format, right? We've got players get to sit down and there's lots of things that they get to choose to play. What is the things that make 7-point Highlander particularly strong and compelling from deck building perspective or from a metagame perspective, or is it just the fact that people get to sleeve up their recalls or their Moxen or their crazy broken strategies that they can't play in Modern or Pioneer?
Look, I think it's a variety of those things. Certainly for me, Standard Wizards has kind of killed. Yeah. They're trying to bring it back, but a lack of events, not entirely due to their fault. There was some kind of global pandemic.
Something like that.
But also just not having that. Like for me back in the day, Standard was a thing you played because there was that. It was what you played to get towards the Pro Tour or whatever, because there was always regionals or nationals or the state championships or whatever that you were building towards, and without those clear goals all the time, it's easy to fall off the wagon of Standard. And once you've fallen off, it's hard to get back on. Whereas for a format like 7-point Highlander, you can build a deck, and by and large, that deck is still going to be playable 2 years from now, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, right? Like, there's a lot of power creep, and that pushes out some of the fun and interesting cards. Probably more for us than it does for Canadian Highlander with
Definitely
the 40 less cards.
Definitely. We got some real shitters in our decks. I'll tell you that. I'll tell you that right now. When was the last time you sleeved up Sleight of Hand? Let me ask you that.
Sleight of Hand gets a little bit of play in some of the combo decks, I think. Or maybe it doesn't anymore, but it certainly used to a couple of years ago.
That's a blue staple. You don't leave home without Sleight of Hand.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Whereas for us, it's, when you want that sixth cantrip.
Exactly.
So yeah, look, I think you've kind of covered off the major things. It is that you get to play all these cool old fun cards. For me, at least, it's that I get to, catch up with a bunch of people who I've known for 20 years or more now, right? Going to these big events, playing with people, like, the community spirit's really good. And yeah, the deck design is just a lot more nuanced and interesting than something like Modern. Like, Modern, once you've chosen your first 2 different cards that you're going to play 4 of, the rest of that kind of builds itself, right? Like, if you want to do well, there's kind of limited space for much innovation. Whereas in Highlander formats, yeah, look, once you say, all right, I want to play a blue-red tempo deck, a lot of the cards kind of more or less automatic. But you do still have that room for self-expression and experimentation where changing those last 4 or 5 slots can significantly alter the deck if you've got, tutors or cantrips or whatever to filter through your deck. So yeah, it just gives people a lot of opportunities to try things and have those exciting games where it's harder to know exactly what your opponent's got going on. Because there's just a much broader range of cards that could be being played, right?
Yeah. I think you really touched on 2 of the things that drew me to Canadian Highlander, and I think draw a lot of people to these types of Eternal Singleton formats, which is that, a format like Modern has sort of an artificial rotation, even Legacy to some extent, where the format's defined by a brand new card from a Modern Horizons or a Lord of the Rings type set, where you just... this is now the format. And the impact of those types of cards is greatly mitigated when you can't put 4 of them in your deck and you don't have a 13% chance of seeing one in your first, in your 7, 6, and 5. And so like, just simply reducing the ability for any individual card to impact the format at such great lengths, I think, is something that a lot of folks are drawn to, and especially for a lot of folks who come from Commander, right, as by far the biggest format that we have in the world at this stage. They're used to that kind of, like, you have a centralizing game plan with your Commander, and then you've got 100 cards, and you don't know what type of game you're going to be playing. And I think it's similar where, you choose your points, and then you have the rest of the cards that surround it. And Game 1 and Game 2 might be completely different experiences. And I think that's a powerful part of these singleton formats.
Oh, absolutely. Well, we do have a little bit of it's not a rotation problem, but like we do get hit by that a bit. That the Betrayal at Baldur's Gate set caused a lot of waves for us. Modern Horizons 2 similarly has significantly changed some of the key slots in a lot of decks. Modern Horizons 3 doesn't look like it's going to be quite as bad.
That's what it seems.
Might disagree
that
with
is
this.
Definitely what it seems.
Yeah.
We will see if that's true.
Yeah. But in some ways that can be exciting as well, that like you getting to see these new cards competing with much older cards, right? That,
Do I want to choose... Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, even if I've got the option to play like 2 Moxes as most of my points, am I better off just playing some kind of Thassa's Oracle combo deck? Yeah.
I think the fact that you have to choose between Tinker and Snapcaster Mage for the 1 point slot in Australian Highlander is like, these cards are 15 years apart. And then you go all the way forward to Comet, right? Comet versus Tinker. Like, which do I want to, balance? Like balance was
Yeah,
an
yeah.
alpha. It's worth 1 point. Comet Stellar Pup was like 2 years ago, also 1 point. So the fact that you have the very powerful new and the very powerful old standing side by side is a very interesting experience, and one that you don't really get anywhere else.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
So I want to talk. I want to pick your brain. You've been on the council, over 10 years, and while you're not anymore, you certainly led to a lot of the some of the fundamental philosophies and some of the guiding stuff of 7 Point Highlander throughout your time involved in the community. What would you say are the fundamental pillars of 7 Point Highlander?
So we've got a couple. There's on the 7 Point website. There's I can't remember what it's called, but like a guiding statement kind of thing from the committee. And what it's mostly about is there's 3 points. One of them is broken into a couple of subparts. But so one, we want the format to be fun. Like we want people to want to play the format because otherwise, there's no point in anyone being here if everyone hates it.
True.
So that's kind of like the primary thing, and it's the hardest one to judge, right? Because it's the most subjective. Is what's fun? At what point is a deck so good that it's not fun for people who don't have that as their preferred deck style or whatever? So that's kind of the primary guiding one. The one that is least guiding and is more used as a tiebreaker is accessibility. So if we're choosing between pointing two cards, and one of them is a $50 card or a $100 card, and one of them is a $2,000 card, we'd rather point the $2,000 card. Just makes the format more accessible to more people, which is a general benefit. And then the ones in the middle are about avoiding repetitive play and repetitive game states and that kind of thing. So this is it's like about the nature of a Highlander format, right? Where you don't want to have your tutors be too cheap because they just lead to people taking a particular line every game, and then you might as well just be playing a 4-off format. But you also don't want to be in positions where so something like the initiative falls foul of this, where to some extent, if you've got the ability to accelerate out an initiative creature on turn 2 or 3 every game is kind of the same. And again, we don't want that. We want to have that variety of gameplay experiences, deck experiences, all of that kind of thing. It's also about trying to avoid positions where within a sort of macro archetype like combo, you don't want one deck to be the only valid combo deck. Because it's just so much better than every other combo deck. But you also don't want to be in a position where within those, combo, control, aggro, mid-range, whatever, one of those sort of pillar archetypes doesn't exist, or is the only thing that's really viable. So, if all decks are mid-range decks, then that's bad for the format. Because again, that comes back to kind of that fun thing where some people love playing grindy mid-range mirrors. Some people despise it. And we want to give them options to not do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's
kind of that's the broad philosophy.
Those are some really good pillars. A lot of them align closely with Canadian Highlander. The two that you spoke on first, I think, are some of the ones that are the most different or the most distinct from Canadian Highlander. And I really want to dive into that first one, sort of the guiding philosophy that you had with regards to player fun, because this is something that's been coming up relatively recently in Canadian Highlander with the latest Canadian Highlander points update. One of the complaints that exist for formats like this is that there are some strategies that are just not fun to lose to, and I think the most distinct are going to be your Thassa's Oracles, your Flashes, and your Time Vaults, right? Those are the three best A+B combos in Canadian Highlander, and I imagine that they are all pretty much the best ones in 7 Point Highlander as well. How much does the quote-unquote fun of a deck's win condition play into the pointing decisions of the committee?
Definitely some. Excuse me. Time Time Vault in particular. So Time Vault is, I think it's 4 points at the moment.
Yeah,
out of 7. It's probably like if you went purely on power level of decks and cards, you would probably strongly consider putting Time Vault back to 3. But Time Vault falls afoul of a couple of things. It's, I don't know what it is at the moment, but let's say it's $1,000.
Yeah, pretty
it might
much.
be more than that.
It's like 600 to 800 US, so about 1,000 Australian.
Yeah. So it's not cheap, but also, it is one of those things that it feels very, disempowering to have a deck like that can just be some percentage of games. It doesn't matter how well you've sideboarded, how well you're doing. They just go turn 2. You don't get any more turns.
Yeah, you will take no more relevant game actions until the game is over.
Yeah. And look, people can concede at any time, but
True.
it's still not a lot of fun.
Yep.
So it's one that definitely falls afoul of that kind of thing. Death's Oracle, people had similar arguments, but it's more pointed on just power level. Flash Hulk is another example where early in the combined lists, it would have been about 2000 I guess it depends when it was printed. Not long after it was printed.
Flash was in Mirage.
Hulk, when Hulk was printed.
That was Dissension, so Ravnica block.
2009 or something?
Was Ravnica?
Oh, was it earlier? Oh, no, that's right.
That was Return.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry.
I think it was 04, 05.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. 04, 05. It was a while after that, because I think it was during the combined period that we ended up putting Flash and Hulk both to 4 points out of 7 because the Melbourne community in particular was just dying because no one wanted to play against this deck because it was the best by miles.
Yep.
So look, it definitely does. It's kind of the starter of a lot of these discussions. Like, if there's a card that everyone's really having fun with and no one objects to, kind of don't want to point it, right? Like, everyone's just having good, clean fun. But if a card's so powerful that it's winning a lot, some portion of people will not be having fun. So,
absolutely.
It tends not to last too long. But yeah, like, if you're pointing something out of a deck, point the bits that lead to less fun games in general. And it is a vague
of course.
criteria.
This is part of the art half of the points discussion, right?
Yeah.
So,
because we do get some pretty good data on some of these events. So
it's crazy. You guys have great data. It's awesome. I was looking through some of the stuff. It's incredible.
Yeah. Particularly from some of these big events. You can see, all right, this is what percentage of people were playing cards X, Y, and Z, which they'd spent however many points on. Not as much data as you'd get on like a modern or whatever, but
sure.
It's pretty good for a homegrown format.
It's pretty good. I'll say that. One of the questions that's been popping up again recently in Canadian Highlander that I want your take on, this idea of fun, I think broadly speaking, biases against combo decks. Is that a problem? Or rather, first, do you agree that is true or not? And if it is that a problem?
Look, I think it is true. Certainly at various points we've spoken about, how good you want fair versus unfair decks to be. And those are kind of loaded terms, obviously, because fair obviously sounds like something you want more of than something that's unfair. And definitely, so let's say you can have a format where one of those big pillars is 50% of decks. I think it's healthier for something like aggro or mid-range to be 50% than it is for combo to be 50%. Because combo does... despite the fact that losing is losing, right? Combo often feels worse to lose to, particularly for newer players, where they're like, I played a 1-drop and then a 2-drop, and then my opponent took 50 game actions and told me I was dead. And they're like, okay, well, I don't understand what happened, and I don't feel like a real game happened at all, etc.
Right.
So, look, I don't think there's a big bias towards non-combo non-prison kind of decks, but there is definitely some bias.
Yeah. And I think it makes sense when you look at formats as a whole because, I think more players are mid-range players and aggro players than they are combo players. It's a smaller percentage of the population. And then you have the people who just want to play the best deck, and at that point, you can't have the best deck be combo because then they'll all play that, and you start pushing up towards that 50% combo threshold, and that can be problematic for a number of reasons.
Yeah, look, and we have had some periods where there were combo decks that were obnoxiously the best. I mean, as I said, we had that Flash Hulk era. We actually had another one just after Thassa's Oracle was printed where at Nationals there was about a dozen players from one team from Melbourne who were all playing basically the same Flash Hulk deck. They didn't end up winning the event, but, that was... they formed a decent portion of the top 8, and it was after that deck got like 5 points immediately, basically.
Yeah. Well, I know Thassa's Oracle went from 0 to 2 to 7 in Canadian Highlander, and it has not moved since. It's stuck right at that 7 point for a while.
I think we went from 0 to 3 to 4.
Yeah, exactly.
Actually, the other combo deck, which I don't know if it shows up as much in Canadian Highlander, it's not great at the moment, but has been very good, is breach decks, particularly Lurus breach decks.
So
have been very good.
Breach, there's sort of two flavors in Canadian Highlander. The first is Slushy, which is sort of a mid-range breach with like Gifts Ungiven and Intuition to sort of set up your Breach Savines Brain Freeze LED combo. Yep. And then the other one is sort of, pure Breach Storm, which is typically Lotus Breach in this day and age. And both of those decks do generally well, but neither deck can play Lurus because we don't have sideboards.
Yeah, that is definitely one of the big differences. Look, we have basically the same. The Lotus Breach kind of traditional Storm deck doesn't get played a lot because hardly anyone owns a Lotus.
as it turns out, not a lot of Lotuses floating around. It's an expensive one.
But, when the couple of players who own Lotuses turn up, it does pretty well. I think it's probably on average slightly worse than the Intuition kind of builds.
Mm-hmm. So one of the questions I wanted to ask was, the points list is very expansive. I mentioned at the start I think before we started recording that you guys have basically double the number of cards on the points list that Canadian Highlander does. What makes that such a strength for a 7-point Highlander? Because it almost seems like Canadian Highlander players are allergic to adding cards to the points list, whereas 7-point Highlanders just seems to welcome them with open arms. What makes that such a strong option for you guys?
Look, I think there's a couple of factors here that philosophically and practically differentiate from Canadian Highlander. And definitely plenty of players don't welcome the points with open arms. There's always a subsection of players who are like, we should just take 5 points off cards. It doesn't matter which ones. The list is too long, blah, blah, blah.
Sure.
And the committee does try to find spots where there's, 1 point cards that you're like, actually, this card's just a dud these days. Like, it's a relic of bygone days. But I think there's a couple of things. So in terms of practical differences, because we're 6/10 of the size of a deck, it concentrates the power of some cards. Some cards I think are probably much better on our list, just because density, you don't need as much. So like tutors are on average slightly better in Canadian Highlander because you need that ability to just scan through your whole deck and get the one card that get the flash or whatever, right? Whereas we're much more likely to be able to dig into that with just cantrips and other things.
But
sort of
cantrips are 60% better in Australian Highlander than they are in Canadian Highlander.
Yeah. But in terms of the philosophical difference, I think there's a couple. So one is from my understanding, Canadian Highlander is very reluctant to put what I would call really good mid-range cards on the points list. Like, there's never been a Planeswalker on the points list.
Correct.
Whereas we've got 5 currently on the points list, 4 currently on the points list. Because, similar to some of the really good mid-range creatures. Like, I can't remember whether Uro is a point on Canadian at the moment.
I'm looking at it right now. Not only are there 4 Planeswalkers on the points list, but 3 of them are 2 points, including and Uro also is a 2-point card. Like, not only are you willing to point, but you're also willing to double point some of these just absolute powerhouses of the mid-range cards.
Yeah, I can't actually think offhand what the third one is. It's Ren and 6, Oko, and what's the third one?
Minsc Boo.
Oh, Minsc Boo, of course. Yeah.
Minsc Boo
is such an obnoxious card.
That is the card closest to being 1 point on the Canadian Highlander points list. Is Minsc Boo. It's not, but it's the closest for sure.
And the philosophy is just that even though we do prefer these mid-range decks, you don't want them to be too good. And the problem with from my perspective, the problem with not pointing some of these cards, like let's say Minsc Boo, is, okay, so now you've got Minsc Boo for free. And that also means that all of the cards that support Minsc Boo are comparatively reduced in points value. So even if Mana Crypt is the same equivalent points value on both our lists, it's kind of cheaper for those decks on your list because the card they want to use to accelerate it out, to accelerate out, is free. So it's about, some of it is about making sure that you're taxing decks appropriately so that no one's, so that everyone is, making use of their 7 points, has ways to make use of their 7 points, but also that people aren't able to add these, like Ancestral Recall to their deck for kind of free because all of the cards that they want to play are 0 points, and they can just be like, well, I might as well.
Might as well just play all of them and my recall.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think one of the questions, and it's interesting to, I'm looking at this, a thing popped into my head. The only, like, Mana Crypt is the same amount of points in your format and ours. Like, it's the same amount. And that's very striking to me that it represents, it's more points functionally, because it takes up of a greater amount, but it's the same otherwise, which is, I don't know what that means, but I just noticed that. I thought that was interesting.
Mana Crypt has gone up a lot of points in the last 3 years. It was 2 points on our list not that long ago.
Wow.
So it was 2 points. Sol Ring was 3 points. Sol Ring and the Moxes have been 3 points basically forever. Because the philosophy was that, Mana Crypt can be faster, but games tend to go long enough that the damage hurts.
That's...
Then, a couple of years ago, Wizards started printing cards such that the damage was basically irrelevant because either, you're playing like... Well, Uro itself, you're not Mana Crypting out that easily on the front half at least. Well, on either half, Andrew. But, like...
I mean, Lelia.
You're playing cards that get around... Yeah. And so that happened. And then we had a strong resurgence of... I think this is the order of events. We had a strong resurgence of bots decks. There was an event we ran during the pandemic where entry was free. First prize was a Mox Emerald, like a unlimited Mox Emerald.
Yep.
That we ran over on Moto.
Yep.
Using the Discord. So we ran it as a league over like 8 weeks or something. And that was great. And the winner of that was a deck called Bots, played by an Australian player whose last name is also Bots, purely coincidentally. And it was obnoxious. This was just after Modern Horizons 1 came out. So he had Urza Saga for free.
Urza Saga was Modern Horizons
Or was that
2, which I think was...
Okay, so it must have been just after Modern Horizons 2 came out.
Yeah.
Because I'm pretty sure he was playing Saga. But yeah. Anyway. Obnoxious.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially backed up by a 2 or 3 point Mana Crypt. That's pretty...
Yeah. So Mana Crypt would have been 3 points there, and then we moved it to 4. And then more recently, as I've alluded to several times, have been having pretty significant points with the initiative mechanic. Significant problems with the initiative mechanic. And the best versions of those deck initially were playing just a bunch of fast mana and sort of the best 7 to 10 initiative creatures. And so to slow those down, as well as pointing some of those initiative creatures, Mana Crypt was pushed up to 5. And, I don't think it's coming down anytime soon.
Yeah, Mana Crypt, what a card. They really did print that and just say, we're never printing a card better than this one. That card's crazy.
Pretty much.
There's a decent argument to be made that it's the best piece of fast mana when you get to the place where your life total doesn't matter anymore, which is what's happening with threats, especially the strength of these threats with two colorless pips in them.
Yeah.
We're seeing a lot of soul mana decks doing really well in Canadian Highlander, so much so that we just pointed Ancient Tomb for the same reason, because those 2 colorless pip spells like Lelia's and Broadside Bombardiers are just ridiculous cards.
It's so funny. Even if you look at just cards that cost a red and 2.
Yeah.
So when, I can't remember the exact order they were printed, but let's say when Lelia printed, she was the best card that cost a red and 2 that had ever been printed by a fairly significant margin.
Right.
But now if you were to, I don't know what the order is, but if you were to pick the top 5 creatures at least, Blood Moon gets in with an argument, but the top 5 creatures that cost a red and 2 have probably all been printed at the same time as or after Lelia.
Yeah,
right?
It's like within the last 3 or 4 years. And
it's
ridiculous.
Completely bonkers.
Yeah, absolutely ridiculous.
So Broadside Bombardiers is another card that people have been making arguments maybe should be pointed. So yeah,
I understand it. I absolutely understand it. So one of the questions I want to ask, and this is something as we see, the power creep, right? The threats strength rise at rates that are pretty obscene in the past few years. Canlander is certainly feeling the effects of that in terms of power creep, right? Canadian Highlander decks are getting a lot stronger. And I think that there's the breadth of the points list for 7-point Highlander helps mitigate, it seems, a lot of that. Let me ask you this. Is there an ideal power level for a 7-point Highlander deck? Is there something that you sort of look at and go, this is what we want the strength of the format to look like, and then help try to shape other decks around that ideal?
Look, there's not any kind of hard and fast rule, but yes, that is the other part of why there's so many cards on the points list, is because we did have a discussion probably in 2020-ish where we said, look, either we have to accept that the power level of the format's going to increase dramatically, or we have to be willing to, play a bit of whack-a-mole on some of these cards. And you can't get everything. The power level is going to go up, but we can, slow that rate of change down a bit. For me personally, the ideal power level of a Highlander deck is about the power level that they would have had in about 2016.
That's
maybe a bit
the
earlier.
perfect, the sweet spot.
But, we can't stop Wizards printing all of this crazy stuff unless someone's got a couple of $1 billion and just buys Hasbro.
Yeah, I'm not thinking we're gonna have an Elon come buy out WotC like he did buy out Twitter. And honestly, if Elon's the one buying, I'd rather he didn't. I'd really rather he didn't.
Yeah. Agree.
Twitter's not doing great. I don't know what you want to. I really don't want to see that. What would happen to our silly little card game we've got here?
You don't want the 25 set to be Modern Horizons 4 : Tesla?
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway,
it's just different Tesla cars, all with different stat lines, and you can spend $1,000, and your Tesla car gets a +1/+0 counter. Like, just
yeah, that sounds about right. But yeah, look, it is part of that point in philosophy that we do try and, or they do now, try and pull that back a little bit. Which is why we've got points on, 3 different initiative cards, which might soon be 4 or 5. Uro, Oko, Minsc Boo, etc., etc., etc. Because we do look at those cards and I think it's difficult to make the argument that Minsc Boo is not as strong as, you know, a Treasure Cruise, or I actually can't remember where the Treasure Cruise is pointed on your list, but like those kind of cards which are older and powerful, and in those 1 and 2 and 3 point slots, like Minsc Boo, like especially if you resolve it early, which is why we've been pointing fast mana at a slightly higher rate than we used to as well, but just ends the game. Like the answers are so limited. Unless you have that lightning bolt immediately, it's very hard to not run away with it.
And even if you have the removal spell, there's still very likely a 4/4 trample haste. That's like the floor is you get a 4/4 trample haste. Even if you get rid of the Minsc, there's still Boo is still there.
Yeah, it's obnoxious.
Yeah. One of the things that recently I ran an online webcam tournament for Canadian Highlander, and in the finals it was a 4-color initiative fast Moxen pile versus a Time Vault deck, and the initiative pile used a couple pieces of hand attack and developed a few sort of like value creatures, and the Time Vault deck had been kind of stripped away but still had one of the pieces available, so it was like do or die, you gotta draw the tutor. And we were sitting in the commentary booth, and I remember making the mark. So 4-color Blood's got a grip on this game. It's all up to whether or not they can close the door. And the player untapped and cast Minsc Boo. And I said, well, the door is closing. The door. It is the amount of room that there was left in this game for the Time Vault player to draw an out has went from 4 turns to 2. Like the door is closing now, and there is not a lot of other threats that do that quite like Minsc Boo. Cards nuts.
It's completely bonkers. The first Nationals after it was printed, where I think it was still 0 at that point. Like basically every deck in the room was playing a bunch of initiative creatures and Minsc Boo and 4 Theolingus and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely. So one of the things that's really interesting to me looking at 7-Point Highlander is how the format's different because you have access to sideboarding, and what that means for the ability of combo decks to be regulated by sideboards, because I think that's something that really is what sideboards do best, is deal with the fact that combos attempt to win on such drastically different axes than typical board-based, mid-range or aggro decks. Do you think that the sideboards have a significant impact in your ability to, manage combo decks because of the way that sideboards work?
Yeah, look, I do. I think sideboards in general are one of the best pieces of technology that Magic's ever developed. Like, I don't know if there were any games before Magic that had the concept of a sideboard, but sideboards do really let you... They let the metagame adjust to a degree without having to go to the bludgeon of ban lists and point lists and whatever. Combo is definitely one of the places. Like, there are a lot of efficient anti-combo cards printed by Wizards these days. Quite a few of them are main deckable. But, you can, if there's a particular deck that you really want to beat up, you can be like, look, I'm going to put 6 cards, 8 cards in my sideboard and really do that. Because in the early days of the format, we didn't have sideboards, and we had a real problem deck. We had a real problem with World Gorger combo.
Yep.
If you're familiar with that one.
Yes.
Which, just in case any of your listeners aren't, it's World Gorger Dragon, when it comes into play, removes all of your permanents. And the idea is that you get World Gorger into your bin, you cast Animate Dead, bring back the World Gorger. It removes all the permanents, including the Animate Dead, and it dies, and then all the permanents come back, and you can tap your mana, and you've got yourself a nice little loop that you can eventually use some kind of instant speed method to kill your opponent. We had a real problem with that deck because answers were much more limited back in the day. Like, this might have even been pre-naturalized being printed, but there was, not that many disenchants that you could play. Removal was much less efficient. And the deck was just really hard to beat. It was one of the motivations for us. And it was, like, World Gorger Dragon itself was 3 points at one point on a 5-point list.
Wow.
Because, deck was just obnoxious. And And sideboards really help with that sort of thing because you can just be like, cool, I'm going to add 4 disenchant effects to my sideboard. And suddenly you go from the deck being unbeatable to some percentage of the time it tries to go off and you remove all its permanents from the game.
Yeah. That is the catch of World Gorger combo. If you get
Yeah.
stopped, you do lose. The game is over for you also.
Yeah, that's right. Someone is losing once you start this combo.
It's very, very feast or famine in that way.
And look, I think that's a real positive. It's also not just combo decks that you can have a big impact on. That a lot of sideboards in the format will start with Red Elemental Blast, Pyroblast, Veil of Summer kind of things. Like cool. So now if I'm playing a control deck, I've got something I can do to improve my matchup against them. So yeah, look, I think sideboards are a huge positive. And I've had arguments with a number of people on various discords and stuff who like Canadian Highlander about this. I think it's for me the biggest negative difference between the two formats is the lack of sideboards. Everything else I'm like, look, I could adapt to that if I had to. Lack of sideboards I wouldn't enjoy.
That's totally fair. I for some reason find sideboarding just an absolute nuisance. No idea why.
Yeah, that's fair.
It's just one of my personal things, and I think that's because I come from Commander, and I started playing EDH in like 2010. So and that was my primary format for most of the time that I played Magic, and so I'm very used to 100 card singleton, and the adaptation to Canadian Highlander was not too much strain for my brain. But when I tried picking up Modern, I don't know, the sideboarding just didn't click for me. So
sideboarding's a really hard skill to learn,
yeah.
particularly in a vintage singleton format. Like even getting to the first level where you know what kinds of cards you want to bring out and in against what matchups is hard. But then you've got the nuance of like, oh, because my opponent is playing, particular cards, I actually don't want to remove Swords to Plowshares in this matchup where I'd normally remove it against control decks because of the finisher they've chosen to use or whatever, right?
Right.
It can be very hard. It can also be very hard sometimes to remember what your main deck is. Particularly when you've got cards which are like, I'm playing Swords main, but I've also got Path in the board, and then occasionally you'll be decideboarding, you're like, oh, are these both main? Is one of them main?
Yep.
Yeah, it can be a pain, but I think it's overall a big positive.
That's very cool. I want to pivot gears a little bit and talk a little bit more about sort of the council and some of the differences between 7-Point Highlander and Canadian Highlander. I think one of the both positives and negatives of the Canadian Highlander Points Council is that they move at a pace that approaches glacial in terms of the speed in which they make changes, versus 7-Point Highlanders Council seems to move very quickly. I feel like you guys are updating points within, a month or two, versus Canadian Highlander tends to wait for, a year or more unless absolutely necessary to make a change. Is that sort of been the way it's been this whole time? Is that somewhat new? Where does that speed come from?
No, that changed partway through. So it used to be that we would just do a points update whenever we needed to do a points update. This was before I was on the committee. Mm-hmm. Or maybe also early when I was on the committee. But then we were having some discussions and we wanted to make the committee be a bit more professional, I guess is the word. So we decided that we would have a regular schedule. So every standard set release, which is what Wizards used to do the banning schedule on, which is why we picked it, we would make an announcement. And sometimes that announcement would be no change. But it gave us a schedule and a timeline, gives players certainty of like, all right, the next time this could change is, date X. So now every pre-release weekend on the Sunday evening, unless the committee are all busy, but by and large on the Sunday evening, there's a stream on Twitch where the committee get together and say, all right, these are the changes we've made. Next announcement is at date X. And so despite the fact that Wizards no longer keeps to that schedule, or they've kind of gone back to it, it's just, every time there's a standard set pre-release, there's a point announcement.
Do you think that it's better for the format to see these sort of frequent changes, or is it, one of the things that I think the Canadian Highlander Council is concerned about with their with increasing the speed is sort of making missteps that sort of linger, or having to, it's up to 1 and then we have to move it back down to 0. Is that ever a concern with the pointing?
It's definitely a concern, and it's definitely a discussion that happens from time to time. And there have definitely been cards that we've pointed and then 3 months later immediately depointed. I'll give you an example in a sec. But I think by and large, it's better to take action than not. There are going to be mistakes made, but on average, there's not going to be that many. Like the committee, and I'm sure the Canadian Highlander Council are like, it's a bunch of smart people who play the format a lot, know what they're doing, know how to differentiate between the power levels of various cards. And so very few of the decisions we've made have been badly wrong. Some of them, there's been a choice where they're like, all right, we're going to target this Thassa's Oracle deck and we're going to point card X. And then a little while later, you're like, actually, that was not the right card. We should have pointed this other card and we're just going to swap them. That happens. But, I think most of the decisions are mostly correct. One example I can give where it was definitely not correct was Scheming Symmetry. So when that card was coming out, we were in the middle of doing a big shuffle on points on our Storm decks. So Storm for a long time had been Lotus at 4, Yawgmoth's Will at 3, so that we could control what other points the deck could play. So, if there was any card that we particularly didn't want in Storm, we could just be like, it's a point, they can't play it anymore. Because they had to play Lotus and Yawgmoth's Will for a long time. Or at least the only good versions did.
Yeah.
We got to a point where that deck was no longer that good. And so we were putting Yawgmoth's Will down to 1, and as part of that, we were going to put points on some other cards, so give them a bit more flexibility, but still kind of restrict them. And this was at basically the same time that whatever set Scheming Symmetry was in was coming out. And so, as part of that discussion, out of an abundance of caution, because it looked like that card could be very good, I pushed the committee to point it, and we did. And then either at the next change or the one after that, we're like, actually, this card sucks.
As it turns out.
It's not only not worth a point, you should never put it in your deck, pretty much.
Boy, is it Imperial Seal, but also your opponent gets it and they draw first.
Yeah. Whereas I was thinking, like, with various instant speed or cantrips and whatever, I've got a lot of mana, you can... it does a kind of Vampiric Tutor impression, and maybe the card your opponent draws doesn't matter, but no, it turns out that the card's just really bad.
Yeah, it turns out.
So look, there have definitely been some mistakes like that. But
what do you think that the mistakes... I mean, I assume this is, one example of, either a handful or a couple, what are the things that are most learned from these types of missteps, or these mistakes where you're like, we didn't quite hit the mark on that?
For me, it was, and this is something we had mostly done previously anyway, that like just that reminder that you should give cards some chance in the hands of players. Like almost nothing is so powerful that you need to point it on release. Like virtually nothing is that strong. And we did point this slightly later, but like there hadn't been many events in that period. Like you need to have some amount of data to support your pointing decisions, even though, as we've said a couple of times, there's a lot of art to it as well. A card needs to be particularly egregious. We've only had 2 instances that I can think of where in our history where cards have been pointed before they were released. So one of them was Lutri.
I was going to say, I was. You said pointed before release, and I said, well, that smells like Lutri. Because
yeah. As soon as that was announced, like we had there was some. I think we took about a week. There was some, small online events of people like, this card is ridiculous, and anyone not playing it is making incredible mistake, because this was before they made the pay 3 mana to put it in your hand rule.
Yep. Back when it was just messed up.
Just messed up. And our discussion. So we pointed it immediately. We didn't point Lurrus immediately because we had a points announcement only a couple of weeks later. And we had been discussing internally, all right, how much points do we put these to? And I think our initial discussion was whether we put Lutri to 3 or 4 and Lurrus to 2 or 3. And then Wizards made the companion rule change and we're like, oh, great. That makes our lives so much easier because now these cards are still very good, but not obnoxious. Like we were talking about whether we needed to just put every companion to a point.
Yep.
Except maybe Omori, because it's not a good card.
There are some bad companions for sure. But starting the game with 8 cards in hand is generally a very good idea. It's a good strategy.
Oh, look. Yeah. In the experimentation we did, I was experimenting with, I can never remember the name, the odd mana companion.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you.
And I'm like, yeah, I would play this card in every deck that could cast it that was aggressive. It is way better than having any 2-drops in your deck.
Right.
But having to pay 3 mana to put in your hand, it's only okay.
Yeah, it gets a lot worse when you have those sort of restrictions.
The other one was immediately before the merged points, the Melbourne points list. They put Liliana and Garrick got pointed before, or immediately on sets release or before the sets release, because they just weren't sure how strong Planeswalkers were.
Right.
So
how far we've come from
how far we've
Liliana
gone.
Vess. Liliana Vess and Minsc Boo are the same card type, and separated by 15 years, they've gotten better at printing good Planeswalkers.
Yeah. And Oko is, I know this isn't a universal experience, but I know a lot of people had this experience where I saw it in the spoiler. It's preserved for all eternity on the Highlander cast. And we're like, I don't know, this card, it's okay, but I don't think it's that exciting.
Yep.
Turns out it is a lot better than its text reads.
It turns out you can target your opponent's cards with Oko Thieving Grounds.
Yeah.
Not only is it removal, but it's also an entire army unto itself.
Yep. And just being a planeswalker that comes in and makes a food and goes to 6 loyalty is already kind of good, as it turns out.
As it turns out. So one of the things I want to pick your brain on, and some of this is self-serving because I did just run a webcam tournament for Canadian Highlander, and I'm, spoiler, might run another. How has the tournament scene in Australia grown over time? And has 7-Point Highlander been able to spread outside of Australia? How's tournaments doing?
Look, tournaments are doing pretty well. There are multiple cities in Australia where they have weekly events which have 20 players for $10 entry, whatever prizes. You get 20 players, sometimes 30 players showing up. And as I said, we have had 2 events this year which have had over 150 players.
That's huge.
So we had like 198 in January, and then in April in Melbourne there was, I think it was about 160 players, 150 players, something like that. Amazing, awesome events. And that's to do with, big support from TOs being willing to put big prizes on the line for bigger entry fees. Like, they were both $50 entry events. But, if you've got 150 players paying you $50 each, it turns out you can rent a nice venue and put some pretty good prizes up.
Yep, absolutely.
And so that's been a big boon. As I said, we had an event during the pandemic online which had 180 odd players. It might have been just over 200. I can't remember. But it was a lot as a league, and that had a bunch of internationals in it. Had a couple of people who've top-aided Pro Tours and stuff playing. It was a free event where you could win a Mox.
People. Why wouldn't you play? It's a really compelling prize pool for. The EV on that is infinite. It's
That's right. There's no bounds. In terms of other spreading outside Australia, we've had some success. We've got a bunch of players in the Discord from other countries. We've got, hang on, I can give you actual numbers for this. So we've got like 170 people who've registered their country as being North America, 50 odd from Europe, variety of others. The difficulty we've had with that is kind of getting the consistent momentum for it, and organizing events because the players are fairly heavily pocketed, because like 160 players in North America is good, but North America is large,
Yes.
and so it's hard to get them together at an event to kick something off. We've had a couple of store level events run in California, I want to say, and a couple of other places. But yeah, it has not been easy. We haven't had the big boon that Canadian Highlanders had of having low league and ready run, be big supporters of the format. Obviously, is a huge help to spreading the word about it.
I think
So yeah,
yeah, Canadian Highlander also has this cheat code of sharing the largest land border in the world with
yes, that's true.
the United States. I think that's a little bit of a cheat code for Canadian Highlander. There's a lot more US players, comparably to. I mean, like, I would not be surprised if 40% of the Canadian Highlander player base was just American,
Yep.
which is definitely a huge boon, being in the same time zone and being just regionally close to Canada.
Yeah. So yeah, in terms of growth, we've definitely, we're still growing. There's people joining us all the time. We're growing more in Australia than outside it. The format's actually more popular in Australia than it's ever been in the past, which is great. So we've got Canberra and Melbourne are still kind of the two biggest groups, but there's really big groups in Sydney now. We've got groups playing in Perth. Adelaide has got a really big group. A couple of groups in Queensland, and then some of the smaller towns in New South Wales and Victoria have also got regular play groups. Like, again, some of those places, like Wollongong has 20 or 30 fairly regular players, which is more regular players than it has for any other format.
Yep. It's very
Yeah.
cool, sort of the little groups of people that will crop up and pick up these sort of homegrown formats. There's a group out of
Yeah.
Iowa that just won that event that I ran. Like,
Oh, very
I-
nice. Yep.
you don't think, oh, Canadian Highlander, yeah, there must be a group of Iowa grinders, and turns out they're really good. They've
Yeah.
been playing, they've been kicking each other's asses and showing up and taking names. So, and then the Time Vault player was I think from Belgium, so we had some, and there was somebody from Brazil that tuned in, and so it's very cool to see these formats that we have start to grow and percolate into these little groups all across the world, even though they
Yeah.
started with the
Yeah.
name of the country in their title.
Yeah, exactly. And our committee is more, like I was saying before, the committee used to be just, two Canberrans, two Melbourne people. And now we don't have like we must have people from various regions rule. But as it turns out, we've got, so Kate from Perth, although she's moving to the US soon, and is going to be replaced at some point in the next couple of months. Raj from Adelaide, Koki from Brisbane, Mouse from, I can never remember, he's from Wollongong. He'll correct me later. And Michael
Get in the
from Melbourne.
comments.
Yeah, get in the comments. Yeah, so we've got a diverse group on the committee, which is great.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
One of the questions that I wanted to prod a little bit, because this is one that really invokes my ire as a CDH player turned Canadian Highlander. You guys run almost exclusively no proxy events, and I've heard all of the story with the Australian WotC and what they've done. But do you want to fill in the listeners a little bit with where the no proxy stuff came from?
Yeah, so I mean, there's kind of two fronts to that. The first one I would say is from a personal point of view, and this is true of everyone who's currently on the committee, position is if your event wants to run proxies, we support you running proxies, right?
Mm-hmm.
Proxies are great. Having more people have more access to the format is great.
Mm-hmm.
But we've had problems for a long time where, officially or unofficially, and this may be one of those things where a lot of people just believe it's true and so it is true. What's Australia is much tougher on proxies than we hear about from Canada, from Europe, and whatever. Like we've had a lot of people from Europe come in and say, but like there are huge legacy events run in Europe where 80% of the room is playing proxies, and Wizards doesn't care. But our understanding is every time a store has done this for any kind of event with prizes, Wizards Australia has talked to them and said, if you do that again, you might lose your WPN status. That kind of stuff.
That's terrifying.
So rightly or wrongly, maybe that only actually happened once and now it's just a rumor among store owners. I couldn't tell you that for sure. But rightly or wrongly, proxies are pretty strongly frowned upon. Well, not frowned upon, but strongly avoided by most of the tournament organizers.
Yeah, it's a safety thing, right? It's a livelihood thing. When your job is to put food on the table for your family, you don't really want to throw around, making moral gripes about whether or not proxies are okay. It's just not a risk you can afford to take.
Yeah. And the other perspective that I know some people have is, so proxies are good, but proxies do... There are risks associated with proxies around cheating, right?
Yep.
Like, no matter how good your proxies are...
I'm very aware.
Yeah, no matter how good your proxies are, it's a distinct possibility that the person across the table from you has made all their proxies like, slightly heavier or slightly lighter, even if they look like they're printed really well. Maybe they don't even know, in a way that allows them to always draw their mocks, right? And that's a risk you're willing to take when it's a $10 tournament and first place is like $50 store credit. But when it's a $50 tournament and the first prize is a $5,000 piece of power, that risk feels much worse. So that's why even at some of the biggest tournaments that aren't run specifically in or by stores, there tends not to be proxies. We have had some proxy events run the last couple of years, and the wrath of Wizards hasn't come down on people, so maybe this will slowly change over time. But yeah, that tends to be the position. We also, I don't know, I can never remember whether it's official or not, but a lot of Canadian Highlander events allow CE and ICE cards.
I think it was my understanding is that it was a formal rule for a while. I don't know if it still is. But I think most stores either are affiliated with WotC and do no proxy, or they just do, proxies are up to 10 or 15 proxies, and you may use CE or IE as your proxy. Those are kind of the two camps I think events fall into these days.
Yeah. I think it was when it was, mostly a Yellow Jacket format.
Yeah.
Yellow Jacket had a rule allowing them, which kind of makes sense. Although, given the price of CE these days, a CE Mox is cheaper than an unlimited Mox, but it's not enough cheaper that it's still a $500 proxy, right?
Exactly. It's the same thing with the M30 cards. And I think there's a world, I think, where we get to the place where WotC prints enough cards of that type that players will just be allowed to play with them in events that want to... Because the true solution to that cheating issue that you discussed is to just have affordable Magic 30 cards.
Oh, look, I agree. Magic 30 makes me so mad.
Oh, yeah. Don't get me wrong. I'm not... This is the only phrase. This is the only thing that I could say positive about Magic 30.
Because I was... Because that announcement was quite late at night in Australian time. I think it was 12:30 or 1 a.m. But I was up late that night and I saw the start of the stream and they started talking about it. So I stayed up for a while and I'm like, oh, this is really interesting. Because when they first started talking, I'm like, oh, they're just doing a reprint of Collector's Edition. That's awesome. That's a fantastic 30th anniversary thing. Yeah. I will buy one of those even though I don't really need it.
I'd pay $1,000 for a rebranded version.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure. And then they're like, oh, it's going to be in boosters. And I'm like, okay, that's weird. Maybe it's just going to be you get 6 boosters and it's just, the 90 most interesting cards from the set. Because Unlimited's got a lot of garbage. Yeah. And the reason they're in boosters is it's randomized, whether they're foil or old border or whatever. And they're like, these are just alpha boosters. And I'm like, alpha boosters suck to open. if you've never looked at the collation of those sets, go back and look at it. I don't know if they reproduce the thing where sometimes your rare is instead of basic land. Hopefully not. But
I
even
think that's one
aside
of the
from
ones
that,
they cut out. I think they cut out that component.
how good.
Now it's like one
But
of your
even
random
aside from
lands
that,
is a soul ring or something. I think they doubled
Yeah.
up on soul rings.
Even aside from that, like the percentage of rares in alpha that are good is not high. Like, yeah, you might open a Mox, but you might open a Farmstead or a Pure Lace, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's a very wide margin between the best rare and the worst rare in alpha. Like nowadays,
yeah.
your trash mythics, they're still reasonable. And the
Yeah.
top end mythics are not Black Lotus, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, for sure.
So with this no proxy, you guys have a very interesting rule surrounding the reserved list. For the uninitiated, do you want to share that with us?
Yeah, so this is something we introduced a few years ago while I was still on the committee. We were trying to find ways to improve accessibility options for players because we had a lot of players coming to us saying, look, I've played this format a couple of times, I really like it, but I can't afford X $1,000 to build the deck I want to build. And I feel like I'm at a strict disadvantage for purely financial reasons. And it was hard to argue with, right? So we ran.
They are.
Number,
Yeah, that's
turns out they are.
yeah.
So we ran a number of surveys. We talked to the community a lot. Like it took us a fair while to come to a decision on this. There were some people who just wanted us to allow proxies, and we kept saying to them, as I've just said, that that's not a committee decision. Like the problem with proxies is if your TO says proxies are allowed or they're not allowed, that's their rule, not ours. So proxies, there was a rule people suggested where you could play, like where we would pick some set of garbage dual lands and say, you can play those, and if you're not playing an Underground Sea, then your whatever the blue-black one in that cycle is an Underground Sea instead. But it turns out that that's just proxies with extra steps.
Yep.
So the rule we ended up on was a rule where if you didn't play any reserve list cards, because the reserve list was just kind of the cleanest
It's a nice
set
boundary.
of cards we could describe. Yeah. And it was something that you could look up on Scryfall or whatever.
Yes,
So if you're not playing with any reserve list cards, you can just play with an extra point. So you're playing with an 8-point deck. Yes, it means you don't have any jewels or etc. Jewel lands being kind of the most common
Yeah, absolutely.
reserve list cards in a lot of decks. But you're getting something for it. So you're not playing a strictly inferior deck. And we have had some situations where we've had a couple of really good players put together 8-point lists by choice. Like they have access to all of the cards they could ever want, but they're like, actually, I can build a really good, I think it was, one of them was a red-white mid-rangey kind of deck. And they're like, yeah, this deck's great. Yeah, it sucks that I can't play a plateau, but there's enough other fetchable lands now that I can play 2 or 3 of them to fetch, and I'll mostly just fetch the Sacred Foundry. Play pre-war formal wear and whatever. And deck's pretty good. So it's not a perfect solution. There are some people who think we should, go to 9 points, or we should expand out the set of cards that are banned or whatever. But it's a solution that lets people get a foot in the door, get some experience with the format in a way where they're not playing a purely 100% worse deck just for financial reasons. 7-point decks are still mostly better, don't get me wrong. Like, most decks in most top 8s are 7-point decks. But it gives people something for their accessibility problem. And honestly, I suspect that, as I was saying, it's been demonstrated by a couple of people recently, part of the reason that most decks in most top 8s are 7-point decks is it's fun to play with those old cards, and a lot of people who make those top 8s are people who've been playing for a long time, very experienced, very good players who already have all the cards. I know from my own personal experience, so as I was saying, the deck I've been playing mostly recently is 5-color Zoo. I could definitely build a version of that wasn't playing all those old cards, but like, I've got FBB Tagers and stuff, and I want to play them.
Yep. I'm right with you. I'm very fortunate and privileged to, in all of my time playing CDH, I picked up my set of duels. I have my LED, my Mox Diamond, which are, the CDH reserve list staples. And then when I moved to Canadian Highlander, the only real big one that I was missing was my Time Vault. And I found a great deal on my time vault, and sure enough, when I go to no proxy events, I'm sleeving up my time vault and taking turns.
Yep. Yeah. Look, I also, definitely come from a lucky and privileged position of, because I started early, I've got a full set of jewels. I've had over time an almost complete set of power. I've sold off a bunch of it. But I've still got a bunch of moxes. And of the 4 moxes I've got, 3 of them cost me a combined about $350.
Yeah, that was the strategy. It was play Magic in the 90s, man. That's what I should have been doing. I was busy being born.
Yeah, look, rookie mistake.
Yeah, rookie mistake right there.
The 4th mox, the Ruby, which is actually the one I play the most these days. I didn't get back in the day, so I bought it in 2014 for $1,000 or something. Which is still, as it turns out, a pretty good deal these days. But yeah, so I do, come from that position of having access to all the stuff I want. The other thing that we've got that does help with a lot of these accessibility issues and proxy issues is we've got a really strong lending community.
Yeah.
So I have seen a lot of events where someone will say, look, I'm looking to play in this event, but I don't own an Underground Sea. Can someone lend me some? One. And as long as someone is willing to, vouch for you, mostly you'll get lent cards. There have been very few instances I'm aware of where that has been abused. And yeah,
That's
a lot of the time going to these big events, if you come into our Discord, you're well known, you can get lent the cards you need.
I think that's something that I do. That is one of the few things that I kind of get value or satisfaction or enjoyment out of with no proxy events is you have everybody sort of meeting new people. Like I've watched somebody post in a Discord, hey, does anybody have an LED I can borrow? They're brand new. Like nobody's ever heard of this person before. And some person's like, yeah, sure, I got an LED. And sure enough, the LED, traded hands at the event. The player went and played it, brought it back. All was good. And kind of the spirit of we just want to play Magic, man. That's all it is for us. And the people who do have the opportunity to acquire the cards being these cards are meant to be played. Yes, they're worth hundreds or thousands of dollars, but they're still game pieces for a lot of us. And nothing against collectors. I'm a collector myself. That's why I have all the cards, because I like collecting them just as much as I like playing with them. But at the end of the day, I'd rather see my cards playing than being sat in a binder, because I think it's just fun.
Yeah, absolutely. If Wizards printed some, an actually good version of Magic 30, and we'd allowed all of those in events, then I would lose a bunch of nominal dollar value, but it's only nominal because I'm not planning to sell those cards anytime soon. Yeah. So, but I'd gain a bunch of new potential, opponents, friends, whatever, people who could play the format and could play whatever deck they wanted, and that would be awesome.
The friend EV on a good Magic 30 set is unbelievable. Friend EV is through the roof.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Well, that's great. Well, as we're coming up on the end of our time here, I want to sort of ask, are there any sort of lessons from, the 25 plus years you've been a part of the 7 Point Highlander community, from your time in Magic? Do you have any lessons to leave the listeners with as we start to wrap this up?
I think the main lesson is, find things that you love and play to those. And if there are things that you don't enjoy, play less, play different decks, talk to your community. Being a good person in your community, as you were saying, the friend EV, the community EV, is worth a huge amount. No amount of value you get in an individual game is worth everyone saying, hey, that guy's a dick, don't trade with him, don't lend him cards. Mm-hmm. Because I've seen it happen to people who, they pull off some shenanigan and may or may not get disqualified for it. But even if you don't, the social capital you lose is enormous. But find formats you love, work with people to grow them. I've met some of my best friends playing this format. Yeah, it's great.
It's awesome. Very positive thoughts. And I think that's a trend that I definitely experience in the Canadian Highlander community. And I'm sure it's not just because there's a bunch of Canadians there, but we have some very wholesome, wonderful formats, and it's certainly my privilege to be a part of them and to share the space with the others who partake in them as well. Do you have any socials you want to plug? Anything you want to shout out before we close this down?
So I'm Mr. Verbal of Vance Notions basically everywhere. You can often, well, you'll always find me in the Australian Highlander Discord, which I'll send you a link for if you want to post it in the
Perfect.
notes.
I'll description it. Absolutely. Anything you want, I'll description it.
You can also often find me in the Loading Ready Run Discord, the Highlander part of that. I'm in the Canlander Discord, and if someone really wants to, they can ping me there, but I don't check it very often.
Awesome. Well, as always, thank you everybody for tuning in and listening to the latest episode of A Conversation Of. It was an absolute blast, and thank you again, Vance, for taking your time to come and sit down and talk about some wonderful Highlander together.
Look, thank you so much for your time. It was great to be here.